I'm going to read you some things. The revolution is communization. It does not have communism as a project and result, but as its very content. In this struggle, the seizure of the material means of production cannot be separated from the transformation of proletarians into immediately social individuals. The overcoming of capitalist social relations cannot involve a simple liberation of labour. Rather, the only way out is the suppression of value itself, of the value form which posits abstract labour as the measure of wealth. Communization is the destruction of the commodity form and the simultaneous establishment of immediate social relations between individuals. Value, understood as a total form of social mediation, cannot be got rid of by halves. The way we do that is irrelevant, so long as that's what we do. Working Class History is a great resource. Go and check it out. Communisation theory is a contemporary form of Marxian analysis that tries to reconceptualize revolution. Communisation theory tears revolution away from this orthodox Marxism that insists that revolution has to have these formal transitionary economic stages. Communisation theory emerged out of the ultra-left in France in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was a critique of the revolutionary left after the experiences of the uprising in Paris in 1968. Some of those who had participated in the uprising wanted to understand why and how it had failed and what this meant for the future of the communist movement. Using Marxist theories and analyses, communisation theory tried to take account of the history of communist revolution, its successes and its failures, and propose the immediacy of revolution. It proposed that the immediacy of revolution was not only possible, but it was essential if we were to overcome capitalism. Communisation theory is sometimes mistakenly thought of as a form of anarchism, but that's not strictly true. And actually, anarchism does not escape communisation theory's criticisms. Communisation theory has different interpretations, and I want to try and explain what communisation theory is, what its differences are, and why it's important. Doing these videos actually takes up a lot of time, so it would be good to know if this is actually something people are interested in learning about. If it is, let me know. Right, so I'm going to give you an overview of communisation and its main thesis. Now, I'm going to present this explanation to you as if it was true on its own terms. So if you want to understand the theoretical reasoning, you'll need to watch other videos in which I explain that. I want to also warn you that you shouldn't define the word immediate as instant. That's very important. So in a very reductive way, communisation can be defined as the process of producing the communist social relationship, or if it's easier, producing communism. In their article on communisation and its theorists, the group Cosmoprolet say this: communisation expresses a fairly simple but important idea. The proletarian revolution is not the self-realisation of the proletariat, but it's self-abolition. So what does that mean? Well, traditional Marxisms, from the Bolsheviks to council communists, have conceptualized communism as something separate to revolution that is enacted in the future after the proletariat have captured the means of production, not with the objective of abolishing value production, but for the purposes of reorganizing distribution. So in this way, revolution is not seen as fundamentally altering the nature of production. It's simply about reorganizing distribution. In this way, the fundamental social relationship of class, that thing that we want to abolish, is not challenged or overcome. On the contrary, it's reaffirmed. So whether it's workers' councils, anarchist syndicates, or a formal dictatorship of the proletariat, the worker not only remains a worker, locked in the logic of capital, but is celebrated and reproduced as such. On the other hand, communisation theory conceptualizes proletarian revolution and the production of communism as essentially the same. Revolution is not a process that starts with a simple exchange of control over production and distribution, with production continuing to be organized using capitalist relations of production for an indefinite period of time, and thus reaffirming the proletariat, it's actually the process of immediately abolishing all relationships of production that constitute the proletariat as the proletariat. So, in other words, rather than revolution and the production of communism being seen separately, with the latter being a future event, revolution is the process of communization, or the process of production of communism, that happens as the content of class struggle. So, the two main protagonists of communization theory are a man called Gilles Dauvé, who is part of a collective called Trop Loin, which translated from French into English means too far. The other is a French collective called Theory Communiste, or TC, as I'll call them from now on. And they're also French, and they produce a journal of the same name, which has been going on for about 40 years. These two French collectives represent the beginning of communization theory, and Gilles Dauvé is actually the person to use the word communization for the first time in this context. His development of communization theory came out of his critique of the Dutch, German, and Italian communist left. He wrote a book which started off this movement, I suppose, called The Eclipse and the Re-emergence of the Communist Movement. These two groups also represent the biggest division amongst the theorists. While both collectives agree on what communization is, they diverge, often quite abruptly, on an issue that is called within communization theory periodization. This debate centers around the fundamental question of how we understand the history and the coming about of proletarian revolution. For Too Far and Gilles Dauvé, the possibility for communization is always ever present. In the past, it's failed because the participants of those revolutions didn't go far enough. On the contrary, TC take the opposite view. The possibility for communization exists only now in the current cycle of struggles, and will rise imminently from the material conditions of capitalist society right now. In the past, revolutions have failed because of the specific period of capitalism that those revolutions happened in, and it's probable that they weren't ever going to have any different kind of outcome. In response to these different opinions, TC accused Gilles Dauvé of taking a humanist approach to human agency, and Gilles Dauvé criticizes TC for taking a determinist view of history. This debate is fascinating and was reproduced by the English language journal Endnotes in their very first edition of their journal. If you want to read that debate, you can do for free. It's online at endnotes.org.uk, and it's issue number 1. Anarchists tend to overemphasize the state, and in doing so lose sight of the fact that the state is another relation of production. By overemphasizing the state and prioritizing their critique of the state, what they do is they lose sight of other relations of production. Is wage labor as a relation of production less important than abolishing the state? For communization, which is about the immediate abolition of all relations of production, this will necessarily include the state in the same way that it would include wage labor. This idea of socialism as a stage towards communism is also described as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Those terms are often used interchangeably. What it essentially represents, according to Lenin, is a formal period of transition. Now, in this formal period of transition, what happens is that the workers take control of the productive forces of society. The issue that communization theory has is that the taking control of those productive forces reaffirms the proletariat as a class rather than abolishing it. Now, if your objective is to affirm the political power of the working class, then that's, going to succeed. But if your objective as a communist is to abolish class, then taking control of these productive forces and reproducing the conditions that make the proletariat, that's obviously counterintuitive. Now, Leninists will say, oh, well, this is just a stage towards communism, that you need this transitionary period in order to reorganize society, and that there will be this formal withering away process. That all seemed very reasonable and very logical, but communization theory does have a response to that and has theorized why it's simply not possible to have this transitionary period. And I'm going to explain that in a different video. Proletarians controlling everything still means that they're proletarian. Being proletarian isn't an identity. It's a social relationship. Taking control of the productive forces of society is all fine and well, but if you continue to organize production using capitalist relations of production, then you maintain the conditions that reproduce the proletariat as a class. So proletarians might take control of the productive forces of society, of the means of production, the means of labor, and so on. But if they are still wage laborers, compelled to produce commodities in order to survive, then nothing has fundamentally changed. It's why workers' co-ops are not revolutionary. They're simply a transference of the management of the conditions that create the working class. So the next theory videos that I'm going to be doing are going to be continuing the explanation of communization theory, specifically the communization theory of the French group Theory Communiste, which I'm going to call TC from now on. To understand TC's ideas, you need to understand their theory of periodization. And to understand their theory of periodization, you need to understand Marx's theory of subsumption, categorized as formal subsumption and real subsumption. So for TC, formal subsumption took place up until about 1900, and then the first phase of real subsumption began in 1900 and lasted till about 1970, when the second phase of real subsumption began. So from 1970 up until the present day, we've been going through the period of real subsumption. In the next two videos after this, I'm going to talk about formal subsumption and real subsumption, and then I'm going to do a separate video about periodization. But first, I want to define some terms. A use value is any object that satisfies a human need or want. That's it. Labour process is any human activity that interacts with the natural world to produce use values. Means of labour are any tools or any infrastructure that humans use to make use values. Social relations of production are any subjective or objective characteristic of a specific mode of production. So, for example, class is a social relationship of production. The state is a social relationship of production. If you want to know more about mode of production, I've made a separate video about that. So I want to just quickly talk about surplus value. Just to recap, surplus value is value created in excess of the value needed to create the production process. So things like wages, materials. Any value created in excess of the value needed to maintain those things is surplus value. Absolute surplus value is surplus value extracted by an absolute extension of the working day. So to get absolute surplus value, you want to have as many workers working as many hours as possible. Relative surplus value is different because relative surplus value is value extracted in production processes which have much higher productivity. So for things like mechanization and things like automation. This means that time devoted to excess surplus value is relative to a decreasing necessary part. So what is subsumption? I hear you all screaming. Subsumption is the process by which the social relations of production penetrate the labour process itself. So put simply, subsumption is the specific process by which capitalist mode of production came into existence. In part 2, I'll describe what formal subsumption is. So this is part 2 of 3 videos looking at subsumption. So if you're completely confused about what I'm talking about, find part 1 because it will explain what we're doing. In this video, I'm going to try and explain to you what formal subsumption is. It's very simple, and I'm going to try and do it in a very simple and pared down way. So before the industrialization of society, or the widespread industrialization of society and the dawn of capitalism proper, we lived in a semi-feudal society where people largely owned or rented their means of labor. The labour processes used to produce use values were for direct use. So, for example, we might rent a bit of land off a landowner, we might make our tools or buy our tools to till the land, to rear cattle. And what we produced on that land, we used directly for ourselves, and occasionally we might exchange it for other use values. Then what happened is that private interests came along and they started to take command of those labour processes. And without transforming them, the labour processes stayed the same. Without transforming them, the capitalists start to impose the wage relation. So we stop being peasants and we start being wage earners. That process is called the formal subsumption of labour under capital. It's called formal only in the sense that it doesn't transform those labour processes. It only takes control of them in accordance with how they already exist. So this means that capital can only extract surplus value from the labour process as it's given, as it exists. So the only way that that can happen is if the capitalist extends the social working day as far beyond what is necessary to create the production process. So under formal subsumption, the capitalist has to try and get as many workers working in that labour process for as many hours as possible during the day. That extraction of surplus value is called absolute surplus value, and it has profound effects on society. As society becomes more industrialized and the capitalist class consolidate their command over these labor processes, we see the peasant transformed into the worker and the social phenomenon of class emerges. The consequences of this process is something I will go into in more depth when I talk about TC's idea of periodization. In the next part, I'm going to talk about the real subsumption of labour under capital. But in the meantime, if you want to read more about this, you can go to my link tree where I've put some articles. In the last video, I talked about the formal subsumption of labour under capital, and now I'm going to talk about the real subsumption of labour under capital. So just to recap, formal subsumption is that period where capitalism starts to take command of labour processes and imposes the wage relation. So before capitalism, a peasant would plough the land, grow crops for themselves and to exchange for other use values. Then what happens is the capitalist comes along, takes command of those processes, that labour process of ploughing land, and instead of the peasant being able to keep the products that they're creating, they have to exchange their labour for a wage. So under formal subsumption, the capitalist has taken command of those labour processes, but it hasn't done anything to them except impose the wage relation. Under real subsumption of the labour process, the capitalist hasn't just taken command of that labour process, it starts to transform that labour process into a more productive one so that it can extract surplus value more easily. When I say extract surplus value more easily, what I mean is more efficiently. And a way to do that is to reduce the necessity of workers and increase the amount of products, use value, commodities that can be produced at any one time. So the period of real subsumption is that period of capitalism where automation and mechanization is introduced to the labor process. So what this means is you no longer have groups of peasants using plows to plow fields. You have several workers using machines to do the same job. What this means for the capitalist is that they can reduce the price of commodities because they're cheaper to produce, thereby meaning they can reduce wages because capitalists don't need as much money to buy these products. That means, therefore, they can keep more surplus value. These innovations also mean that you can increase surplus labor without having to increase the amount of workers. More machines means less necessary labor time, which makes extracting surplus value more efficient. This is called relative surplus value. Unlike under formal subsumption, where you need as many workers working as long as possible in the day, under real subsumption, you can reduce the amount of workers. This then creates precarious working practices that increases the reserve army of labour and makes it more difficult for workers to get jobs. This then acts as a disciplining measure. If there are less jobs, it means that workers are less likely to jeopardise those jobs by taking industrial action. Not only this, but mechanisation and automation means that the capitalists can de-skill workers. So you no longer need skilled people to do skilled jobs, you just need anyone to press a button. De-skilling along with precarity and cheaper goods means that capitalists can reduce workers' wages even more. What we are now experiencing in this final phase of real subsumption is the totalizing effect that capitalism has had on society. If this sounds terribly bleak, that's because it is. But there is a way out of it, and I'm going to talk about that in other videos. This is communisation theory in like a sentence. I've just been thinking, if people say they love tea but don't drink Yorkshire tea, can they actually love tea? I don't think they can, you see. If you say that you love tea but you don't drink Yorkshire tea, I think that you're deluded or just lying. That isn't actually what I wanted to talk about, though. One of the questions I get asked the most on this app is, what ideology do you subscribe to? And sometimes this is asked in a genuinely curious way. Other times it's asked as an accusation by people who want to get one up on me for some reason. Now, I don't like this question for a lot of reasons. I don't think political terms are necessarily helpful. I don't think they necessarily clarify things either. But mostly I don't like this question because it reduces communism to a battle between ideas. And communism isn't an ideology that you identify with. It isn't a program to be realized. Communism is a social movement. And when I say that I am a communist, I'm not ascribing to a fixed ideology or to a program that you put into practice. I'm attaching myself to an effort, a task that is imminent to the world of capital. And this effort, this task, it's immediate and it's distant, and it's located in the possibilities of class struggle. That said, there is obviously a history of communism and there is different traditions within it, so it's kind of obtuse of me to say that this tendency is not locatable within that history and within those traditions, because obviously it is. So I'll try and answer it directly, or as directly as I can. I'm what you would call an insurrectionary communist, or in a more sort of wider and clumsier known term, a communizer. For those who aren't quite sure what communisation theory is, or if you've never heard about it before, I'm going to try and give you a very brief explanation. So communisation theory is both a critique of the ultra-left and also associated with the ultra-left, depending on who you talk to. And I think for the benefit of ease, communisation theory could be described as French left communism, which is distinct from, critical of, but also draws from Italian left communism and the German Dutch left communism. So I suppose if you wanted to be really lazy about it, you could call me a left communist. But communisation theory, or the communisation tendency, emerged after the 1968 Paris uprising and was an attempt to critically assess why the French working class, despite having all the necessary components that received Marxist wisdom said were the ingredients of revolution, the proletariat instead didn't take up communism and went back to work, and the uprising ultimately failed. And communisation theorists weren't satisfied with the explanations that traditional Marxism offered and wanted to understand how this turn of events was possible. So from that has developed what I think is an incredibly important contribution and clarification of communist theory. But communisation theorists do tend to argue at quite a high level of abstraction, and they're often accused as a result of that of being elitist or obscurantist. But they're actually trying to tackle really complex issues, and operating at such a high level of abstraction is just an unavoidable consequence of interrogating reality in the way that they do. That said, for an accessible introduction to communisation theory's sort of basic theoretical framework, you should read this pamphlet. It's short and relatively easy to read, and it quickly changed my life. It's called The Eclipse and Re-Emergence of the Communist Movement by Gilles Dorvé and Francois Martin. I got mine from Antagonism Press for £3, but it's also online. So there you go.
Do a communisation theory, true or false? Okay. True or false, communisation theory rejects the dictatorship of the proletariat.
So communisation theory, one of its central ideas is that after a revolution, or in the course of a revolution, there's no pre-communist stage. So you don't go from capitalism to some form of managed capitalism, which people call socialism, and then there's communism. It all happens in one continuous period of time. Now, when a lot of Leninists talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, they talk about it in the context of it being a pre-communist phase, right? And that's what communisation theory rejects. So you might read in Gilles Dorvé or in Theory Communiste, communisation theorists talking about how they reject the dictatorship of the proletariat. But this is the concept that they're rejecting is the Leninist concept or the Stalinist conceptualization of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a pre-communist phase. In the actual definition of the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's a period, it's a historical moment that emerges in the course of revolution. It's not it's like saying you reject tomorrow. It's not something that you reject, it's just a fact that will happen.
So true or false?
False.
Communisation theory is just a form of anarchism.
Some anarchists have a sort of adopted communisation theory language, and it's a superficial reading of communisation theory by anarchists have led them to believe that it's, you know, this anti-state, anti-hierarchy thing. But communisation theory isn't interested in the concept of hierarchy in the same way that anarchists are. They're not obsessed with this idea of authority. And anarchists sort of centre the state as a specific and unique social relationship that requires special and unique problem solving, whereas communisation theory just understands the state as a social relationship like any other, and in the course of revolution will be abolished. And, you know, communisation theory is very much rooted in Marx's analysis. I mean, it is quote-unquote Marxian in the original sort of iterations of communisation theory. And actually, Gilles Dorvé has written extensively rejecting this sort of co-option of communisation theory ideas and language to essentially just mean whatever you want it to mean. Communisation theory is something really specific. and is not a form of anarchism. In fact, it's a critique of anarchism.
So false.
So false.
True or false, communisation theory thinks communism can be immediate.
This is a big one. This is a big one that communisation theory gets criticised about all the time. And most of that is because people don't read the texts properly. So the central thesis of communisation theory is that communism has to be immediate, right? So people hear this and they think this means instant. Communisation theory is not saying that there will be a revolution and then suddenly communism will just emerge fully formed like by magic. It requires the class to actually take up the activity of producing communism. But what communisation theory is saying is that there can't be a pre-communist phase. The actual content of the revolution has to be the production of communism. It can't be the capturing of pre-existing economies, which a lot of Leninists and Stalinists advocate, and then sort of reorganising the management of a pre-existing communism to create some sort of economic haven that will, magically, bring in communism. That's just equally as nonsensical as saying that it's going to be instantaneous. No, communisation theory is not saying that it will be instant. It's saying that the course of the revolution, the content of the revolution, has to be the production of communism. So in that sense, it's an immediate process that begins from day one of the revolution. So false.
Okay, thank you very much.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Bye.